Yeah, so if we go to view, I'm on a Mac, but you know, it should be basically the same for Windows. You should have the same toolbar at the top here. And so here, if you go to syntax, so what these are like basically like parsers or like lexical sort of like libraries for particular like languages, and you can see they have a ton of them. You know, they have a lot of options here. Some pretty esoteric languages like Haskell, and all the way to stuff like, you know, pretty modern stuff like Rust. But basically, you know, this is like a wide support. And then what you can do as well, of course, because this is a modern editor, is you can go to, I think it's gonna be maybe, I think, is it tools? Yeah, probably this, probably plugins.
Yeah.
You know, I don't mess with Sublime Text as much, but you know, I think essentially you can go and you can create a new plugin for yourself. This is like in Python. So this is Python to allow you to make your own Sublime Text plugin. So we don't want to do that in particular, but whoops. What we can do is we can actually go, I think, and probably, I guess it would be here. Okay, package control, cool. So I guess if we go now to, I should have read that text before I closed it because now I don't remember what it said. But essentially, it's going to let us install packages is basically what I was trying to get at. So maybe if we go to, oh, here we go, cool, packages. So yeah, so these would be like, I would have to go download the package, right? But it's telling me basically to like navigate to a Sublime package. And so I could go download a package for like potentially like any language I wanted. Like, so even the ones that aren't really like necessarily included here in this sort of syntax, these syntax definitions. But, you know, it has pretty wide support. So this kind of like support, along with stuff like these sort of like macros or commands that are pretty code specific. These are kind of like what differentiate Sublime Text from something like Notepad, where you just have like a lot of assorted tooling and commands and macros that you can use specifically for editing code. Keeping in mind that, you know, Sublime Text does not ship with some kind of interpreter. It does not ship with essentially like build processes or anything that would allow you to actually like package or compile programs. So that's kind of what differentiates it from like a development environment. So in your mental model of this, you might say like, at the lowest level, you have like Notepad, like just a core text editor, and you have this on Mac too. It's called like text edit, which text edit's almost more like a word processor. I mean, because you have all these like sort of kind of word processing features, like allowing us to indent and make paragraphs and change.
Yeah, but you can export HTML files from text editor.
Yes, yes, nothing's going to stop you from doing that. You can make whatever files you want, but keep in mind that an HTML file is not a compiled, like HTML is not you're not creating binaries or like essentially like you're not creating program like application code, which for some languages, unlike HTML, which is like a markup language, what you're creating really with HTML is like a definition. So you're saying like, I'm creating like info or like data, and I'm just like using a concise representative language, which is HTML. With a program or application code, what you're doing is you're writing algorithms. And when you do that, or you're writing like procedures. When you do that, you're writing code that will then be like compiled or like interpreted using like an engine for that particular language. So for C, for example, the C language, we use this thing called GCC, which is the C language compiler, the C language family of compilers. That's going to create what's called like a binary, or like a kind of essentially like ones and zeros that the computer can like
That
understand.
the computer renders.
Well, for a C program, it would kind of like store it in memory and execute it. It would basically just follow all the instructions. So yeah, I don't want to say rendering for the C case. It's almost like it's like it's storing all of your instructions and then figuring out how to run them. Might be a good way to put it, but yeah, for the web, what we're doing is we're essentially building documents that the browser, as like a program itself, it knows how to like interpret our documents. So it knows how to interpret our HTML and our CSS, and it knows how to collect them in a way to show us a web page. So when you say a text editor produces an HTML file, I mean, I can write C code in Notepad too. There's nothing that's going to stop. I can write C code in here, but what this won't do is compile that C code. So it won't turn it into a program that I can execute. And in fact, Sublime Text won't do this either. There's nothing that would let Sublime Text do that. Though we could write macros or like commands that we can run from Sublime Text to say, hey, go tell this other program to like build my C code into a program. Because Sublime is just geared towards developers. So it's just a program that gives us a lot of assistive tools to let us do that.
Cool. I don't want to derail what you have planned with more questions about text editor, but.
No, it's all right. Yeah.
I think I have a question too. Is when you use a text editor, but if you save that file with an extension that is appropriate for the code, that will be executed, like it will work where you need it?
Extensions are more of like file extensions are more of an operating system convenience.
Okay.
You can actually, I mean, they're an operating system convenience, meaning like it helps your computer recognize files. And they're also a program convenience. A program convenience is in, it helps other programs figure out what to do with the file, or like how a file should be interpreted. So it's a very like loose standard of like saying, this file is a .html file, so I'm going to try to open it as though it's an HTML file. There is no real like, it still has to be formatted like an HTML file to work. Just because you put like .html on a file that you save, yeah, it's not necessarily going to. And we can actually try
okay,
that.
yeah, I understand.
Oh yeah. I mean, I think it's good to know like like there. It's just to say there's nothing too special about an extension. It's just a convenient way for us to recognize files and for programs to do the same thing. So yeah, but that's a good question too, because that does kind of come up a lot. Like if you forget to give it the right extension, then a program can reject a file because of that. So yeah.
Exactly, yeah.
Okay, cool. I mean, are there any more? I mean, I think it's okay. This is we're just gonna kind of go a little bit further, but I don't want to go too much further ahead of the regularly scheduled sessions, in case someone didn't know about the extra one. So yeah, I mean, if there's any more questions, I'm really happy to answer them in case people are interested. But yeah, if not, we'll just kind of go ahead.
I have one more, unless Idris or Mo want to take a stab.
Okay, cool. Yeah, shoot.
Yeah, so you can take, so within the inspector, can you take the code, like the HTML code, and place it in Sublime Text? Like, uh,
That's
is the code like transferable?
sure. I see what you're saying. Yeah, that's a really good question too. Um, no, not usually. So yeah, and we can kind of take a look. I mean, in some respects, yes. I mean, there's certainly some ways. I mean, so if I do, for example, something like this. So if I say copy inner HTML, outer HTML here, this is going to give me a perfectly like satisfactory like node. There should be technically nothing wrong with this. It should be totally usable. I guess like code wise or like syntax wise, I would think, because that's kind of like the intent and purpose of that like function or that like feature, is to do basically like what you're suggesting is like, I mean, it's a debug tool. It can help you replicate functionality. So if I said like, I kind of like, for example, I like the way that this, where was it? This. Like I like the way this navigation looks, so I could say, you know, copy the outer HTML, and then I could get essentially everything that's like going on in here, and I could kind of like break it down for myself and try to figure out, okay, like what exactly is happening in here, and maybe I could try to like sort of reverse engineer the functionality. I think it was the kind of purpose behind that feature. So I guess in that respect, like technically you could just go all the way down and like, I mean, technically then you should be able to just copy this in the same respect, and then you could get the whole, basically the whole page. But what I want to point out is essentially a lot of times what you get with this sort of like rendered form is you're getting like the sort of like final, like even if you have, for example, some like dynamic HTML, like say if I have some HTML that's generated with JavaScript, that's something people often do, and what's being done in this case. So for example, you can imagine, unlike the pages that we've been creating so far, where it's this static content, whenever I load this page again, and we'll just go ahead and, well, I don't think I can really do that. I don't know why I expected that. Oops. That's great. So if I go ahead and load our sample that we were working on last week, I'm going to delete this. Yeah, if I go ahead and load this in the browser, no matter how many times I load this content, it's just going to be the same every time. So there's nothing like dynamic or new about this. Whereas this content here, I think we've talked about in the past, you know, this is loading depending on sort of what is in my Git repository on the back end. So they don't have HTML on this page that says like the word resources and then this text content here, right? Like they're getting some definitions from a server, and then they're building elements dynamically depending on what I have stored, like what code I have stored and like what changes I've made using Git. So in this case, what I'm getting for some of these elements is going to be a lot of these sort of like weird, maybe like, it's not nonsensical, it is valid HTML, but basically it's something that I wouldn't want to use for a core page because it has sort of these like sort of extraneous class references and IDs, as you can see, like hashes, which is done in a certain way for some people. It'll have like a lot of these auto-generated classes, classes that are part of like a framework. So for example, this has like a pretty impressive list of classes here: box row, focus gray, this kind of stuff. That can tend to happen in when you're using like a front-end framework where you are generating a lot of simpler HTML using more complex but like abstracted elements. So what do I mean by that? I mean like this item here, when someone is coding that, like over at github.com, like someone who works there, they're probably referencing this in a pretty succinct way. They probably have a reference when they're writing code for the page that says like, okay, anytime we have like a list, a list of these kind of folders or possibly files or something like that, like we want to use this, they probably would call it a component. In this case, kind of looks like it might be called like JS details container or something. That also might be auto-generated actually. Sometimes it's hard to tell when we reverse engineer like this, but they're probably messing around with something like that and they're moving it around on the page. They're not totally focused on what shows up here because that work would have already been done, down, sort of lower down. So when they're laying out this page, they're not necessarily laying out this stuff. They're hopefully borrowing a larger component that's like they trust will load files and folders in a manner that's like consistent. And they're maybe controlling elements like this, which are going to be basically the same every time the page loads. Like this isn't going to move around, but the name will change here, stuff like this. So this particular part of the page, you can see like commit author, user mention, this kind of stuff. These are also going to be wrapped up in like, again, I'm going to consistently kind of use that term, like components. So these are like small elements that aren't part of like the HTML standard that are made in a custom sense to wrap a bunch of HTML elements together so they can be used more conveniently across like an application or a page. So if I were working on a page like this and I went and copied this HTML to kind of like summarize my answer to your question, in the environment that I developed, like wrote all the code to work on this page, like it would not be very useful for me. Like it wouldn't, and it might not even really work actually, like kind of plugging it back into itself because some of this stuff is rendered dynamically based on data from the server. So if I try to reference something like this, which is clearly data from the server, because this was like a commit message I made, like it's gonna, it might not style the same way I want. It might not work the way I expect because some of this data is like referencing server-side content. Like this is clearly like an ID here. So it's like, would be used to look something up, but that might change or be different every time I load the page. So I guess the answer is like, it depends. It depends on what kind of application you're working with. For small things though, I would say, yes, it should at least be valid HTML. It's just the question is like, is it valid in your context for your use?
Can I just say something, ask a question?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So just so I understand you, are you saying that this code is dynamic in that, if you were to capture it at a certain point in time, it would be different at another point in time?
Yeah, dynamically generated code is a little bit hard to understand in some respects, but I think maybe I might be overcomplicating it a little bit, or the way that it sounds, but
no, it's fine. I appreciate your explanation. I'm just It's just like it's more of a curiosity question,
Sure.
right? Like,
It
Okay.
sounds
you
to
know,
me like there's elements to the code that are contingent upon your interaction with it when there is JavaScript, so it's like where it says like last month, 1 hour ago, these kinds of things.
Right. Yes.
Like these things are like contingent either upon like some sort of like time scale or location, anything that is like dynamic in the sense of the word, that it is like subject or prone to change. And so then that has to be reflected in the code. And
at any given time, right?
yeah, and so then
And
I
your
guess, so yeah,
browser
so like
allows
if
it to
you're,
do that. Like your browser is the reason that it can do that. At first, it's just characters, but when the browser renders it, that's what it produces. Is that right?
Um. Hmm. Yeah.
Like the
In.
browser will produce code, not like,
Oh. Okay.
I don't
Yeah.
mean that in the most deep sense, or more in the most technical sense. I mean like on the front experience, like it's going to produce different like dynamic code based on the request that you send to the server, right?
Yeah, yes and no. So what I'll say first is that the browser is capable of, like, I mean, the browser has a JavaScript sort of like engine and interpreter. So the browser can run JavaScript on the page. So the browser can do things like, for example, I mean, we can view some like dynamic HTML, and we can actually watch it happen in real time. So let me show you some, just so we can get a feel for what that looks like. So basically, like what you're maybe terming like browser generated code, which I still kind of hesitate to say, so I want to clear it up. So I inspected this here, this add file control, right? So what's happening is if I click this, you see, so something just happened, right? So we can close it again and then it goes away, right? So this is like kind of like browser generated code in a way. What's happening is there's JavaScript that's basically like adding elements to the DOM. It's manipulating the DOM as we move around the page or click things. And it's adding these nodes to the DOM. Or it's making modifications to existing nodes to change the way things look. In this case, like,
can you quickly remind me the acronym of DOM?
sure, that's the document object model. So
Okay, yeah, thanks.
yeah, so the document object model again is like it's the sort of stored data that the browser put together when reading your HTML code. So like you gave it the HTML document and it made this model using your document, kind of like, looks like a tree, so that it can quickly render and maintain its like reference of like what should be on your page. So if you click certain things,
Yes.
it like, yeah. So that's like an example of like some like kind of in browser, what we might say like client side dynamic stuff. Okay, but the other things, so this thing like 1 hour ago, or like stuff like maybe like this set of like folder names and file names and stuff like that in this list here. What's happening here is this came from like a server request. So if we go over to like network, we might not be able to see the actual request that, oh shoot, I just messed it up. Hey, when I do this, okay, reset sorting. Yes, okay. So we might not be able to see like the exact content that we want, but we can maybe get a gist of some of it. It's probably going to be this kind of request. So maybe this is kind of what we want, sort of. This kind of looks like it's serving us some HTML, which you can see here. It says type is HTML. So essentially what's happening is a server request is made. And what we're getting in response is actually an HTML page that's generated by the server. So there's dynamic code. When I say dynamic code, I just mean code that is built to render like and create like HTML documents, like essentially code that writes code that looks like this. And how is that done? I mean, there's a number of like sort of frameworks that help us do that. In particular, we can use things like components, like I mentioned, to do this sort of thing, where we use JavaScript in combination with HTML to say things like, for example, let's say like, for instance, I was making a bunch of HTML pages that had something along the lines of like a paragraph with like a link in it. I, had the link with some text that you could click on to get the link, and then maybe surrounding the link, there was some paragraph text like this. I don't know why you would ever want to like write code that would help you generate something like this, because it's like a little silly. But let's say that we did want that, and in fact, to add on to that, we wanted the sort of like code that we put together to actually like change the paragraph text depending on like what day it was or something, or maybe even depending on some data that the user stored. And then we wanted the paragraph to like be used across multiple different pages on our website, right? So yeah, our home page, we have like maybe like an about me page, and we have like a details page or a contact page. Instead of copy pasting this same HTML code here, what I could use is something like these sort of like one of these front-end frameworks, which you may have encountered in like learning about some like web development, which are like sort of a more recent move in technology to like basically make web development easier. And the way it does it is I can build things like, sometimes they're called components, sometimes they're called directives, where I would just say, I would create my own custom node type that would be like paragraph with link, okay? Now, this isn't like a real element that like is supported by the HTML standard, but using one of these front-end frameworks, I could basically write some JavaScript and some HTML as a template. So I could write a template for paragraph with link that looks like this, and I would say like, this is the basic template. And then I can include references to some of this data that I want to appear dynamically within this template every time a document is made. And then I could say, usually the way this is done for a custom element like this is you give it custom attributes, which we're kind of familiar with now. For instance, the link tab has the href attributes. So for our paragraph with link, we could say something like paragraph text. And we could make that attribute. And we could say something like, this is the text. And so what would happen is in our template, we would say something like this. This is just some random syntax. Don't worry, don't read too much into this. It's just an example, but might say like that, or we might, use brackets, or I don't know, something like this. And we'd say like paragraph text, right? So we'd reference this attribute in our template that we're making, and then it would show up when the document was built, because we had some JavaScript code as part of our front-end framework to like interpret this custom element we made and say, oh, okay, you have a definition for this, you made a template and you wrote some JavaScript. I'm gonna run that, and I'm gonna make an HTML document that like looks like this, and it sort of dynamically like renders or produces some HTML that the browser then renders to look like you expect. So that's probably what's going on with something like this, where, you know, the server is like generating these documents that are sort of custom based on some data that the server has on that end. And, you know, that to do that kind of thing usually takes a lot of like different sort of resources and additional like JavaScript. So, you know, it looks like they have this frameworks JavaScript here. I'm not exactly sure like what GitHub uses. Sometimes you can sort of figure it out. I'm sure it's something like, you know, one of the more popular ones, like probably Vue.js or something like that. But they're also using something to essentially build these quick and easy like templates where they can quickly kind of render alike things or similar things without having to write tons and tons of HTML themselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's cool because one of the common errors that occurs in browsers is 404, which is server request timeout. Or like, do you ever get, you know what I'm talking about, where there's like a page won't load or something and it says server request timeout?
Yeah, yeah.
And so then that's like an instance of dynamic JavaScript not happening. And so then you don't see the page, you know, because you have to get something, you have to receive something from the server that you're interacting with.
Yeah, in that case, you might want to serve something like that because, yeah, like if you don't have, if some of your requests like weren't successful, then yeah, you'll want to like give something like that because yeah, like I mean, yeah, it totally depends like on, like you usually won't see that for something like static pages like this where, yeah, we're not depending on like network requests or anything like that. But usually you'll see a 404 when the base page, like the request, because each of these things, like, you know, there's requests for not only like server data. So like, we can actually see this. So if we break this down into HTML, right? We're actually breaking down like all of the individual like sort of like core HTML like documents that are used to make like to put this page together. So there's this HTML document called combined branch status, right? So this itself could give like a 404, like you mentioned, like a good timeout or something like that. In that case, I don't think they would show like 404 for the whole page, but for instance, like just on that part of the document, it might say 404, or maybe they would find some other way to like hide the error. So sometimes they'll try to account for stuff like that, but yeah, for sure. That can happen when you try to do dynamic sort of server-side stuff, especially in that case.
So if I can field another question.
Sure, yeah.
So with like Sublime, does it come with templates? And then what's the best way to interact with those templates or to publish the templates?
Sure, that's a good question too. Yeah, so again, Sublime is like not my biggest forte, but Sublime can do some templating stuff if I remember correctly. So I think this might be what we want. Snippet. Yeah, let's. Okay, so there you go. It looks like Sublime does have what they're calling snippets. This isn't the same thing, by the way, as like a well, it is a template, but I just want to be clear, like you would, if you were using, like if you committed to a front end, it's called a front end framework. So let's just look, for example, at one that I am somewhat familiar with. So this is essentially, yeah, this would be a template. So we just created this template. We went to tools and we went to snippets, and it looks like Sublime provides us some typical snippets for, and it detected our file type. So it just knew that we were in an HTML file because of that extension. And again, about that extension, like nothing special. It just has a list of supported extensions, and it said, oh, cool, yours is HTML. Like it's not doing anything incredibly special to like read the HTML to figure out if you're using HTML or not. It's just that file extension. So if I change this to a .c file, it would think that I'm trying to do C code, and then it would look really weird. But in this case, yeah, so we have some like stock snippets that we can use, which are super useful. So in this case, if you were trying to like spin up an HTML page really quick, you could pull up this snippet. Sublime Text is really useful for that. We can make a new file here, and then we can maybe save it as like, yeah, we can say, I mean, this doesn't really make sense, but we can save it as a C file. So now it's going to think we're using C. And then if we say snippets, now we get all of these C specific options. So this is kind of like templating. So for example, this would be like a main function. So it kind of puts this together for us. So this is like a common entry point for a C program, where, you know, you have this main method, and then if we were to compile this code, then if we run it, it would just return 0. So this is like a really useful way of like templating. And actually, if I'm not mistaken again, what you can do is you can make these yourself, which is very useful. I'm not exactly sure how you typically go about doing something like that in terms of like Sublime, but maybe could be helpful to just check out like, oh, and by the way, okay, I'll get to that in a second. Yeah, so maybe you could look into like, oh, wait, we found it. Okay, cool. So if I got a new snippet, I can actually make my own snippets. It looks like I have to use their like framework for doing that. So this is like basically they have their own markdown language, similar to HTML. It probably looks a little bit like HTML. I assure you that it is not. It's like special to Sublime. So you can make your own snippets, which you can then use to quickly generate code for yourself. So, which I find that really useful for sure. I use stuff like this at work. So as far as templating stuff for like a web application, it's pretty advanced. But we can look at a quick example of just some of these. So we've already, you know, very quickly, if you start learning about Vue, you get introduced to this idea of components. So this is actually pretty nice because it kind of demonstrates exactly what I was talking about. So this here is JavaScript, and what you're doing is you basically, all you've done is included the Vue.js code, this JavaScript. So you'd load that on your page first. What that's going to do is create a bunch of functions that you can then use within your JavaScript to interact with like Vue's component like templating system. So, and again, just to be clear, this is different from the templates we were talking about in here. This is basically just like auto code. You can think of this as just like there's nothing happening on a server or anything like that. It's just like, it's saving you from having to copy paste a bunch of stuff. So this is one way to think of templating. So basically, you know, saving yourself a lot of work and kind of saving some snippets that you often use or templates that you often use in code or that you find yourself using a lot, and just having those recallable very quickly so that you know, let's say the next time you, for instance, like try to make a paragraph with a link in it, maybe you can just quickly recall one of these snippets and say, oh, give me that, you know, paragraph with link or something, and then it'll insert that for you. That's different from having your website render dynamically new content with a paragraph and a link in it, depending on some data that you give it. So just to clarify that, that would be something that you'd do with this. So what this is doing is saying, it's using JavaScript, you're creating a template, which uses actually, in this case, an HTML we should all be familiar with in this session. So we've used list items before. This is just a list item, similar to what you'd see in an unordered list or an ordered list. In this case, they're going to use an ordered list. And what they've done here is they've defined this to-do item, which is now a custom component, which they've given a template to. And with their Vue code included, and this JavaScript included on their page, which again, this might be over the head a little bit. That's okay. I just want to introduce it to you so that you can kind of be aware, like you can do this kind of thing. You can now reference that as long as the JavaScript code is available to you on the page. And what will happen is when the browser is pulling together all of the documents, including the packages you'll have created to essentially like create the documents that you'll have used Vue to put together, it will load not this necessarily at all, but it will load this template instead. So this is kind of like a way of telling JavaScript code to fill in the blanks, sort of like kind of like color by numbers, but like with code. So you're saying like, all right, everywhere you see to-do item, run this JavaScript, which populates, like replaces this with this template. And to do that, there's software happening. It's called like a package build process, which runs some JavaScript to basically pull together all of these documents dynamically to render this HTML properly. And you can see here, we're getting a little more complex. So what it's doing, you can kind of, I know this is a little bit complicated again, but essentially what we're doing now is like we're getting more advanced. We're passing data into this template. So we're saying like, not only do I want you to like swap out this to-do item with this template, but actually I'm going to give you a to-do. Like I'm going to give you some data in JavaScript. Okay, that's what's happening here. So this it's called a vbind in the Vue case. And in JavaScript, I have an item, just an arbitrary item, which comes from this grocery list here. And what it's doing, basically, what I'm trying to get at is it's actually taking the text from the item and doing a custom element just for you to create this list. So this list is, you can just think of it just like this. So there's this custom component defined, which we can give some data. And then what it's doing is constructing elements based on your templates with this data that you provided. So I just wanted to, I guess, distinguish between, you know, something like a template and Sublime Text, if you would come across that, versus something like a template using like a dynamic front-end framework. Similar looking things, but different goals, purposes. So like if you made something like this for Sublime, what you'd just be doing is like just saving you some time by not having to type out like lit. But that's what you're going to get if you make a template in here. You're not going to be able to like do something like to do text and then define something in Sublime Text that like will output some file. I mean, I digress a little bit because actually you probably could write some code to do that, but you know, what you see is what you get out of that kind of process, where in the JavaScript case, you can actually dynamically render, or you can dynamically affect the DOM and add or remove nodes using stuff like this. So I think that was kind of all over the place, but hopefully.
No, that's awesome.
Okay, cool. Nice.
I'm like trying to wrap my head around things, but it's good.
Yeah, this stuff, I mean, this is, you know, down the line. You know, we haven't gotten into JavaScript yet. That's something that I want us to get to very soon. And so once we get to JavaScript, I think we'll have more tools to be able to talk about stuff like this. But I think it's cool to think about for the time being, because I'm sure some of you have run into this problem in your head, at least, of like, well, you know, how would I like, you know, I don't know, like check the date and then like show that on my web page, but only if it's like the person's birthday or something, and I have that stored. So like stuff like this, and then like if I want to do that, like how do I avoid like you know, if I have a bunch of like menu items on my page, but I don't want to like keep copying pasting the same menu item code everywhere, like how could I kind of wrap all of this up in a succinct way? And these are some of the kind of answers once you get to scale. I would say that front-end frameworks can be sort of overkill, you know, to a certain degree. I mean, these are for like what are called like web apps. So like GitHub, you could argue is like a web app. Like, you know, it has like functionality that is very like sort of dynamic. I can interact with it. I can make server requests. I can submit data. I can get things back based on some of the things I just did. I can perform a lot of actions. I have user settings, you know, stuff like that. I mean, this is like a pretty complex application, really, that does merit a lot of this. Like, it makes a lot of gains from the complexity reduction that you get from using something like Vue, where, I mean, look at something like this code here, right? Or this code, right? This code, arguably, is a lot easier to read, or this markdown language, I should say, is a lot easier to like read and quickly like interpret compared to writing basically like this. So if I would have to like copy, in fact, we can just really quickly maybe, because I kind of like that exercise. So say I copy this, okay, and I replace this instead. So all of these to-do items, just to give you an idea of like, you know, what actually happens. Okay, so it would be basically for every grocery list item, right? I would then have one of these, and then, but this is all dynamic content. So I'd have to come up with a reference for each of these for the JavaScript that I load on my page. So I'd say like, you know, grocery list, you know, in JavaScript, we index arrays like this. And so I'd have to say something like this, right? And then this, all of this is even assuming that I can even, you know like how many grocery items I have. So I'd have to do some JavaScript there to like check how many grocery lists basically, not to mention just all of the syntax errors in this, and just that this isn't even valid JavaScript. Basically, this problem presents itself, and it presents itself often where it has difficult solutions. And this is a pretty, you know, good solution, arguably. Though it does introduce a lot of like overhead, a lot of technical overhead, and a lot of like sort of removal from what is called like standard JavaScript. That's another problem with it. So like this JavaScript you're seeing here, like view, like these words, like component, like this isn't, if you're just learning basic JavaScript, you're not going to see these words or these properties or these like sort of like functions because they're not part of standard JavaScript. So you're introducing another layer on top of your JavaScript, just your basic vanilla JavaScript. So that's another concern as well. So it kind of complicates things, but it gives you some advantages. That's basically what I'm trying to show you with this. There's in-betweens, by the way, that kind of solve this problem. So like probably heard of, or you might have heard of like jQuery. jQuery is like it's not a full front-end framework. It's a JavaScript library. So it's essentially like a bunch of really useful tools that help you solve a lot of these problems without the whole overhead of like a full-on front-end framework. So most people, when they use JavaScript, in fact, use something like jQuery because it just makes everything a lot more accessible. Anyway, just wanted to introduce some of those things. Wouldn't worry so much about them right now, but hopefully, oh, and it looks like we're almost out of time, but hopefully you learned some stuff this week, about kind of like professional development workflows or differentiating between a text editor and a development environment and like what a text editor should be responsible for, what the browser is sort of doing with your documents when it gets them and with your JavaScript maybe.
Thank you.
Sure, yeah.
Thank you so much, Paige. It was really good, actually. For me, it was kind of the first time, so it's like, okay, I'm catching up with
Yeah.
you were saying.
Thanks, Paige.
Yeah, no problem. Does anyone have any like last questions or anything? I know we didn't quite do like the stuff we were doing last week.
Just to clarify, we have a class next week, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah. Yep. So that and that one I'll be just picking up where we left off. So we're going to be going through again our. This is the same example here. By the way, I wanted to note, as per was requested last week, I got that example uploaded. So this is up. So don't worry about like trying to copy it down real quick or anything like that. This is up on the GitHub here. That's why it says an hour ago. So I just put it in tutorial and then I just made this new home here. I don't have a link to it. If you click this web page yet, I don't have a link to it. So to load it yourself, you'll just do what I did and you just drag it there and you can mess with it if you want to change it or anything. But next week, we're going to get more into these paragraph elements. We're going to learn about the div and we're going to do some CSS to this. So we didn't do any CSS to this sample yet. And we're going to add some new elements and maybe try to link around a little bit.